hold the phone. Kill her at 3 o'clock. Stand back and observe.
The male gaze, not just simply the look of half the world's population, but a perspective that is driven by sexual desire and pleasure. The term was originally coined by film critic Laura Mulvey in her essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, a landmark moment in film theory that Mulvey saw simply as specific only to the context of the 1970s when she wrote it, the women's liberation movement of the time, and the failure of New Hollywood, where directors had more individual freedom away from film studios to establish a new norm in the representation of women on film. Since then, Mulvey's writing is now at the heart of feminist film theory and is vital in the discussion over representation that is currently defining so much of 21st century culture. Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema explored how the unconscious of patriarchal society has structured film form, using the psychoanalytic theories of Freud and Lacan to explore how woman stands as linchpin to the system, symbolising the castration threat by her real absence of a penis. In order to control this fear, the dominant patriarchy then places the woman under the gaze of scrupophilia and voyeurism, taking other people as objects and subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze. Whilst Lacan's analysis of scrupophilia was primarily along the sexual interest of children in an active gaze, Mulvey explored how the male gaze is one of protection, created in order to protect men from a fear of castration. In order to achieve this, Mulvey writes, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so they can be said to connote to be looked atness. However, the women's visual spectacle as a result works against the narrative of the film, freezing the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. In order to solve this disconnection, the male gaze is integrated into the narrative and as a result integrated into the codes of filmmaking. If one is in want of an example of the male gaze within filmmaking, then look no further than the film that Mulvey herself cites in her essay, Hitchcock's Vertigo. In Vertigo, the gaze of Scotty, the male protagonist, is given a legal grounding in his occupation as a police officer. After developing a fear of heights, however, he is forced to retire but is hired by an old college friend, Auster, to follow his wife, Madeline, who Auster fears is in a state of mental confusion. The audience follows Scotty's investigation primarily from his point of view. As Scotty follows Madeline, as Mulvey states, he watches and falls in love with a perfect image of female beauty. In this scene, Scotty's active sadistic voyeurism is displayed as he looks upon Madeline in the same way as she looks at the painting. Quite simply, Hitchcock displays the definition of objectification, and the audience, through Hitchcock's narrative structure and extensive use of point of view shots, is sharing his male gaze. In Mulvey's words, through means of identification with him, through participation in his power, the spectator can indirectly possess her too. Though Vertigo not only displays a male gaze, it is a film obsessed with it. Ultimately, it is the obsession with looking that Hitchcock aims to explore in what is often described as his most personal film.
Well?
It should be back from your face and pinned at the neck. I told her that. I told you that.
We tried it. It just didn't seem to suit me.
Please, Judy.
After Madeline commits suicide, Scotty is thrown into a grief until he meets Judy, a woman who looks strangely identical to Madeline. In this pivotal scene, Scotty transforms Judy into Madeline's image, in an action similar to how Hitchcock famously formed his female protagonists. Hitchcock himself described Vertigo as a film about necrophilia, in which a man is in love with a dead woman. However, Mulvey's statement that Vertigo is cut to the measure of male desire may be all too simplistic. Tanya Modleski, in her book on Hitchcock and feminist theory, highlights how the one moment that Scotty is not present within the narrative and Judy is engaged in a rather long profile shot that precedes a flashback that reveals Judy to have been hired by Alster in order to dress as Madeline so that Alster could murder his real wife and frame it as suicide. The woman that Scotty has been following was in fact a creation, simply Judy dressed as Scotty's ideal woman. This flashback, that importantly was almost not included in the film, places the spectator within the final act of the film in a battle between Scotty and Judy's point of view. Ultimately, it is with Judy where audience sympathy lies. Modleski notes that Vertigo is a film in which the female character of Judy and Madeline is like a living doll whom the hero strips and changes and makes over according to his ideal image. Such a fact means that Hitchcock in fact analyses how femininity is simply a male construct, a male design. Vertigo acknowledges the castration fear at the heart of the male gaze, and importantly shows a male protagonist that never manages to achieve his fundamental wish to possess the woman. The work of Alfred Hitchcock highlights how the male gaze is ingrained at the principles of filmmaking and narrative structure. Cinema as an art form is obsessed with the look. Look at the work of the greatest auteurs of the 20th century, Hitchcock, Lynch, Kubrick, Tarantino. Each is fixated upon the act of looking.
Put your hands up! On your head! Do it! Get on your knees! Do it! What are you doing? Who are you? What's your name? What's your name?
Jeffrey.
Jeffrey what?
Jeffrey nothing.
Give me your wallet! Give me your wallet! Jeffrey Beaumont? What are you doing in my apartment, Jeffrey Beaumont?
I wanted to see you.
Are you kidding? Who sent you here?
Nobody.
I've seen you before.
I sprayed your apartment. I took your key. I didn't mean to do anything except see you.
However, the male gaze is a principle found in many art forms, notably fine art and sculpture. The aim of our exploration from this point on, however, is to examine whether literature has the same ingrained male gaze as that of cinema. If Hitchcock is the master of cinema, let's turn first to the master of literature, Shakespeare. A comprehensive and fully analysed view of Shakespeare's representation of gender, sexuality and desire, and whether or not his representation of women is radical for the time, is impossible here. His work is so varied and dense that to confidently state whether he as a writer shows a frequent male gaze would require investigation primarily given over to him, with time which we do not have available, for we have much to cover. Therefore, I will aim to perhaps provide a more generalised focus on one specific example. Shakespeare wrote female characters as equally varied as his male ones. They're central to plot and action, showing intelligence and wit like Rosalind in As You Like It, Desdemona in Othello. At the same time, many are as flawed as his male characters, and also clearly expendable, lazily developed and present only really to serve the erotic pleasure of male lovers such as Hero in Much Ado About Nothing. But whilst Hero is undeniably a product of male desire, Beatrice in the same play strongly contrasts this, showing a woman that is not tied down by male expectation. What is important to establish at this point is that central to Mulvey's visual pleasure and narrative cinema is the fact that the male gaze is not simply a view of women as tools to sexual pleasure, not simply a voyeurism, but a process by which men can dominate through patriarchy. There's a reason why she begins with psychoanalytic analysis. In voyeurism of the male gaze is only one aspect of its existence. It is not only a look of desire, but also a use of patriarchy in order to gain sexual pleasure and gratification for men at the expense of women. Therefore, it is safe to say that the male gaze is central to Shakespeare's work. More accurately, he is obsessed with patriarchy. Having begun writing under Queen Elizabeth, it is a preoccupation, perhaps forced upon him, in which his sole role became to write plays for this monarch. Throughout his work, male power is explored, whether this be in The Taming of the Shrew, with the dominance of the language of hunting to enforce patriarchal order, or in what we shall now turn to, in the explicit suffering of female characters due to the violence that is driven solely by sexual desire. It is in these instances in which Shakespeare shows a dominance of the male gaze. For instance, in Titus Andronicus, famously Shakespeare's most bloody play, it is vital to note the inciting instant of the play is not Titus's sacrifice of Tamara's son, for which she will later gain revenge, but the fact that the new emperor is not granted his wish to marry Titus's daughter Lavinia. More importantly, it is not Lavinia that originally refuses to do so. In fact, she never comments on the matter, whisked away by her brothers and Bassianus, the man she has already agreed to marry. Therefore, what leads Saturninus to choose to marry Tamara, making her empress and giving her the power to wreak full revenge on the Andronicus bloodline with the protection that she requires, is an argument over the possession of Lavinia, which is driven by two men's sexual desire. What is clear is that Lavinia would rather remain with Bassianus. But importantly, at the moment where Bassianus first raises concern over the match, he does not state that Lavinia does not wish to marry Saturninus. He is in fact not concerned for her opinion, but states that this girl is mine. Therefore, Lavinia is presented from the outset as a prize to be claimed through the use of the pronoun I and the stage direction in which Bassianus chooses to seize Lavinia, with the clear connotation of greediness in Shakespeare's verb choice. This is more important due to the fact that later, when Lavinia is brutally raped by Tamara's two sons, it is due to their wish to conquest her. She is a woman, therefore she may be wooed. She is a woman, therefore she may be won. She is Lavinia, therefore she may be loved. Through his use of tricolon, Shakespeare links the verbs wooed, won and loved, meaning that love becomes entangled in conquest and abuse. It is therefore male desire and an inherent male gaze that views Lavinia as an object to deliver male pleasure. That is the sole motivation behind the most brutal act in the play, in what is Shakespeare's most brutal play. Also, of note is the fact that they do not only rape her, but also cut off her hands and tongue, therefore leaving her without any ability to communicate. They make her now what they would rather have her, someone who is solely there to provide sexual pleasure and unable to offer any opinion or intellect. They can look and she cannot complain. It is this exploration of how the male gaze and desire is enabled by a power imbalance created by a patriarchy to cause immense human suffering when characters become dominated by it that is a central theme in so much of Shakespeare's work, whether that be in Othello or Measure for Measure. And Shakespeare is not alone by being led by it. John Webster demonstrates patriarchal power in The Duchess of Malfi, showing its titular character choose to remarry not because of social obligation, but because of her own erotic pleasure. Webster is driven by Elizabeth's rule at the time, showing a connection between her and the Duchess. The misery of us that are born great, we are forced to woo, because none dare woo us, he writes.
I prithee, who is greatest? Can you tell? Sad tales befit my woe, I'll tell you one. A salmon, as she swam unto the sea, met with a dogfish, who encounters her with this rough language. Why art thou so bold to mix thyself with our high state of floods, being no eminent courtier, but one that for the calmest and fresh time of the year dost live in shallow rivers? Ranks thyself with silly smelts and shrimps, and darest thou pass by our dog ship without reverence? Oh, quoth the salmon, sister, be at peace. Thank Jupiter we both have passed the net. Our value never can be truly known, till in the fisher's basket we be shown. In the market, then, my price may be the higher, even when I am nearest to the cooking fire. So to great men, the moral may be stretched. Men oft are valued high when they're most wretched.
Thomas Otway's Venice Preserved features a Venetian senator engaging in a game of cat and mouse with a prostitute. In a particularly memorable scene from the recent RSC production, he removed his suit to reveal a full lycra bodysuit. The scene shows one of the most powerful men in Venice pretend to be different animals. He crawls around on all fours, being a dog. He is therefore dehumanised by his desire, forced down by its bestial instincts to experience perverse pleasure. More importantly, the situation places the woman as the bearer of the power through male desire, elevating someone that through occupation lies at the bottom of the hierarchy to the very top. It is important to begin with Shakespeare due to the fact that his writing has defined the path of literature ever since. His characters and words still dictate what is written down today in literacy, allusion, spoof, or even plots with minor hints to Shakespeare's. Therefore, he dictates the way that writers show the relationship between masculinity and femininity. For instance, Angela Carter's Wise Children, with the frequent references to Shakespeare's plays used to elevate the father of its central couple of abandoned twins, a celebrated Shakespearean actor, to a position above them, and alludes their own lives to that of Shakespearean tragedy. This dynamic is brought to the forefront in Emma Rice's recent adaptation through the contrast between the sadness of the many Shakespearean allusions compared to the joy of show tunes.
Welcome to the wrong side of the tracks.
Crack my cheese! What could possibly go wrong?
Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, to which we shall now turn, uses allusions to Shakespeare to highlight the corrupt male gaze of its central character. Dorian first falls in love with the character of Sybil Vane after seeing her perform in many of Shakespeare's plays. As a result, his interaction with her is defined by the fact that he's been able to legitimately gaze at her due to their relationship existing solely around a theatre. From the outset, Dorian treats her as a work of feminine perfection. He cries how Sybil Vane is sacred, an adjectival choice, which shows how Dorian believes her to be something worthy of admiration, but also of protection, implying the stereotypical view of women as dolls which could be shattered at the slightest touch. For Dorian, there is seemingly nothing wrong with Sybil. He wishes to place her on a pedestal of gold, which further reinforces his wish for her to be displayed. In fact, his intention for her after marriage is to show her off to high society as an actress in the West End. His fundamental wish is to gain a companion, or even a wife in the traditional sense, but actually something that he can gaze at without consequence. In fact, Wilde clearly shows how Dorian does not fall in love with Sybil, but the characters which she plays. He refers to her not as Sybil, but more frequently as the characters of Shakespeare. I have had the arms of Rosalinda round me and kissed Juliet on the mouth, he cries. This personification of fictional characters means that Sybil's personality and very existence, at least from Dorian's perspective, is entwined with that of some of the most classic female characters imaginable. She becomes, therefore, the definition of perfect femininity. In addition, this foreshadows her suicide. As Juliet and Ophelia committed suicide, so will Sybil. Her death becomes fate. And even after death, this ingrained male gaze remains present. She is demonised. Henry calls upon Dorian to put ashes on your head because Cordelia was strangled. Cry out against heaven because the daughter of Brabantio died. But don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. Her life becomes worthless. Remembering her becomes wasteful. And why? Because the Shakespearean allusion highlights what Dorian wants from a wife. Someone that is there when he chooses to visit, like one would take a trip to the theatre. Sybil, when she takes the decision to move further from her theatrical life, denies Dorian this. He has fallen in love with the characters, the concept of love and femininity, but not Sybil herself. The greatest irony is that in her death she has enacted the tragedy. She becomes, in her final moment, the very characters that Dorian so admires. What the audience is given a chance to realise is that Sybil is independent of the fiction, in a chapter given only to the Vane household and not to the presence of Dorian Gray. What is interesting, therefore, is that so many adaptations of Wilde's text remove all mention of Shakespeare. The 1945 film, for instance, has Sybil Vane, played by Angela Lansbury, not as an actress, but as a cabaret singer. Whilst this keeps the sense of ingrained voyeurism, it loses the sense that Dorian falls in love with the performance. The most recent adaptation of the novel removes this gaze completely, with Dorian and Sybil's relationship shown only outside the theatre, and in a desire to sex up the classics, Dorian and Sybil share a sexual interaction. Their romance is far more typical, and Dorian's refusal of her, in this version brought about by a sudden pregnancy, more to be expected. However, the male gaze is present elsewhere in many scenes set in brothels and opium dens that bring forward the implied theme of pleasure present in the original text, but dispense with the specifics of Dorian's love for Sybil. In addition, after Sybil's death, a second romantic interest, a character of intellect and education, is brought forward. The examples so far have shown a demonstration of a male gaze which, at least partly, reflects the context of the time. whether that be a dominant sense of patriarchy or the upper classes' disregard for those below them. The 20th century allowed an opportunity for writers to explore male desire in its most pungent and voyeuristic forms, perhaps due to the influence of the newfangled moving pictures. One such case is Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, in which Humbert begins a relationship with the 12-year-old Lolita. The first-person narration creates an alienating experience for the reader, placing them close to an undeniable male gaze.
That's where we have our informal meals.
Perhaps if you
My pastries win prizes around
Perhaps
here.
if you let me have your telephone number, that would give me a chance to think it over.
1776.
1776. Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, so easy to remember. Oh, you must see the garden before you go. You must. My flowers win prizes around here. They're the talk of the neighborhood. Voila! My yellow roses, my daughter. Darling, turn that down, please. I can offer you a comfortable home, a sunny garden, a congenial atmosphere, my cherry pies.
Well, we haven't discussed how much.
Oh, something nominal. Let's say 200 a month.
Yes, that's very...
including meals and late snacks,
yes.
etc.
That's very reasonable. Well, it's very nice.
You couldn't find better value in West Ramsdale.
No, well, when would it be convenient for you to have me move in?
Well, right now. I mean, it would be silly for you to go to a hotel, monsieur.
Both my bags and the taxi. You're a very persuasive salesman, Mrs.
Thank
Bates.
you. What was the decisive factor? My garden?
I think it was your cherry pies.
Oh.
The book itself is structured around Humbert's desire to in some way possess Lolita, with descriptions of her appearance given in much detail. But most significantly is the fact that he refers to her and other children that catch his interest as nymphets. In Greek mythology, nymphs are beautiful young maidens that maintain the natural world and, whilst not immortal, live many years before death. This creates an idolisation of Lolita, but vitally in the literary tradition, such fairy-like creatures seduce and often abduct men, becoming the modern image of a femme fatale. Therefore, it places the blame of Humbert's gaze on Lolita herself, casting her as some sort of seductress who deliberately entraps the narrator. It places him in denial. And the very fact that nymphs are known to live for surprisingly long periods of time with their beauty intact shows Humbert's desire to keep Lolita as she is, to entrap her in her moment before pubescent development. Nabokov demonstrates the corruptness and abusiveness of this male gaze, highlighting how such a dominance of sexual desire removes childhood innocence. It perhaps demonstrates in extreme terms what many feel the male gaze is in its very nature, and is one of the best explorations in literature of its being. There is a stark similarity between Lolita, with its alienating and stilted first-person narration, and the character's tendency to refer to himself in the third person, with Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. They were written only a few years apart, and of course both turned into iconic films by Stanley Kubrick. In A Clockwork Orange, the presence of a similar abusive gaze is present, but masked by Burgess through his use of nadsat, a fictional language which he created for the book. Breast becomes grud, testicles yarbles, and woman devotska. It creates a very alienating experience for the reader and ensures that this book of just over 100 pages has an incredible effect. For much of the descriptions of violence, the reader has little awareness of what is happening until it has happened. Burgess gives you very little to hold on to, creating a very strange and disjointed relationship with the central character. The use of nadsat to a certain extent masked Alex's enjoyment of his sexual and physical abuse, making the male gaze implicit rather than explicit. Stanley Kubrick, in his film version, which has perhaps become more famous than the original novel, places the male gaze at the forefront, beginning with a disorientating shot of Alex looking directly at the camera.
There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. And we sat in the Korova milk bar trying to make up our razoo dogs what to do with the evening. The Korova milk bar sold Milk Plus Velocet, or Synthemesk, or Drencrum, which is what we were drinking. This would sharpen you up and make you ready for a bit of the old ultra-violence.
The reason that the male gaze comes to the forefront in the 20th century cannot simply be placed down to the shifting morals and growing feminist movement, but also to changes in readership. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the novel form was not highly regarded, with poetry seen as the greatest form of artistic expression. And look at many poems from these periods and a male gaze will be very clearly present, whether that be in Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty or Keats's La Belle Dame Sans Merci, which displays similar references to sirens as encapsulated in Lolita. As a result, there was a great feminine influence in the novel form. So many of what we now regard as the greatest works of literature in these periods came from female writers. Whilst they may not have been as well regarded at the time, and with the novel form having a majority female readership. In the 20th century this shifts. In the interwar period, the Penguin paperback aimed to produce cheap yet highly literary works, publishing huge ranges of stories. As a result, the format gained reputation, and naturally, when something gains reputation, the men like to jump on board. J.D. Ballard argues that in the 1960s, men were the main buyers of novels because they had the spending power and women did not. Literature can shift, therefore, to more male subjects. What is more male than exploring the dark depths of desire? And Ballard himself does reflect this. His 1975 novel High Rise, in which a micro-society breaks down into an anarchy of violence and rape, takes a very male position, focusing on three male characters, each from a different position in the class structure. A description of a clear male gaze in its opening pages foreshadows the lechery that is to come. The main character, Dr. Robert Lang, meets his neighbour. Her proximity, like her easy style, appealed to Lang, exciting him in a confusing blend of lechery and romantic possibility. Placing lechery and romance side by side, Ballard hints at a blurring between these two forms. Can any romance not be driven by a voyeurism and sexual urge? As a result, he puts the bestial and animalistic base drives of humanity at the forefront. It is these drives that the society will later follow. Ballard's legacy is very clearly apparent, whether that be in the 1980s Doctor Who serial Paradise Towers or the recent smash hit Parasite, and Bong Joon-ho's earlier Snowpiercer, in which class position is dictated by architecture. In Ben Wheatley's recent film adaptation of High Rise, with a script by his partner Amy Jump, the male gaze is used as a cinematic device. In the opening act, slow shots of Lang surrounded by air hostesses are used to create an atmosphere of decadence and glamour, creating an environment in which the high-rise, which can intoxicate the inhabitant. As the film moves into its later, more violent acts, the male gaze is broken down. The film's later orgy sequences have none of the glamour, but a lot of dirt, grime and humidity.
worry.
I'll survive.
I don't doubt it. You're an excellent specimen. I thought you were empty.
I just moved in.
I'm Charlotte Melville.
Hi. Sorry, I must have fallen asleep.
God, I hope we haven't frightened him off.
So what if we have?
So, we come to a conclusion of sorts. We have aimed to see whether the male gaze is an ingrained part of the literary form and tradition. In reality, we didn't actually need to read anything to answer that question. You can all ignore all that was said, all works reference, for they do not in fact hold the overall answer, apart from the fact the male gaze can be clearly demonstrated to have existed since very early works of literature. In cinema, the look of the director and the character is the look of the spectator. If the character displays voyeurism, the spectator will be forced to share this, at least for the film's running time. In literature, it is up to the reader what they see. The reader has the dominant perspective. A writer may describe a voyeuristic gaze, but it is up to the reader whether or not they share it. The reader imagines what they want to imagine. In fact, a reader can see a male gaze when it is not shared with the author, with the reader. As we cross into ego psychology, the reader can place their own sexual desires onto a text. What is also important to note is that the male gaze has begun to be broken down, explored and undercut. In a companion piece to Lolita and A Clockwork Orange, the Me Too movement has led to a wave of works exploring male desire and abuse, often from male perspectives. Whether that be Stephen Burkoff's monologue Harvey, David Mannett's controversial Bitter Wheat, or Thomas Vinterberg's film The Hunt, with its recent theatrical adaptation at the Almeida Theatre, which shows a primary school teacher wrongly accused of sexual abuse and the ripple effects that this can create. Whilst the play and film is about a societal witch hunt and the breaking down the expectations of male desire, in reality, it is a story of whether or not society can forgive.
We are a small community. The happiness of our children is everything.
She can't walk down the street without people staring.
Is Lucas coming on Christmas?
Not this year, no.
He always comes.
I don't think he's coming this year.
Back then, on the day, she knew, so you must have done something. Something to her.
Published last year, Taffy Brodesser Anker's Fleishman is in Trouble is a masterclass in how to use perspective. Beginning is a tale of a man now divorced from his wife, enjoying the sexual pleasures that online dating provides. Fleishman is in Trouble spirals into something that begins as a typical third-person omnipresent narrator, but is revealed to be in fact narrated by one of Toby's old school friends, who Toby has recently reached out to her in light of his divorce. As a result, much of Toby's struggle to care for his two children and balance this with his work, as well as his annoyance over the sudden complete disappearance of his ex-wife Rachel, is tinged with a sense of irony as the stereotype of the mother as the single parent is reversed. In its surprise final act, as the rug is taken from under the reader's feet, the narrator herself meets Toby's ex-wife Rachel, and in one 50-page-long section, in stark contrast to the short episodic structure of before, fills in her story, adding a lost perspective. Fleishman is in Trouble therefore becomes not just a simple story of marital breakup, but a partly autobiographical work that ends up being filled with anger and rage over societal expectation and patriarchy. In the end, it aims to make the point that multiple perspectives make for a more fulfilling narrative. Anger, which is reflected across mediums. It's the anger that flows through Hannah Gadsby's groundbreaking stand-up show Nanette, which has fundamentally blown shockwaves through the form, in which she argues for the pleasures that can come from multiple perspectives, all perspectives. And recently, the female gaze has started to emerge, aiming to change the fundamental language of art. So, to end, let's complement the perspective of which we have explored.
L'homme intéressé par ma fille est milanais. Nous partons là-bas si le portrait lui plaît.
Vous pensez que vous allez y arriver? À la peindre?
Elle a épuisé déjà un peintre avant moi. Vous allez devoir la peindre sans qu'elle le sache. Parce qu'elle refuse ce mariage.
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
Ça raconte l'histoire d'un orage qui monte. Regardez-moi.
Combien de temps restez-vous?
6 jours encore. Et quand vous êtes embarrassé, vous mordez vos lèvres.
Et quand vous êtes troublé, vous respirez par la bouche. Les mains.
La silhouette.
Vous me voyez comme ça? Vous me reprochez la suite? Mon mariage?
J'ai un nouveau sentiment. Le regret.
The poor souls outside by a sycamore tree. Willow, willow, willow. Her hand on her bosom, her head on her knee. The fresh streams run by her and murder her moans. Sing willow, willow, willow. Her soul tails fell from her and softened the stones. Sing all the green willow, 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 willow. Sing all the green willow. My gallant shall be. Let nobody blame him. He's corn I broke. Sing willow, willow, willow. He was born to be fair, I to die for his love. Sing willow, willow, willow. Sing willow, willow, willow. My gallant shall be. At home my love was love, but what said he then? If I caught more women, you caught with more men.